Speaking of being troubled, your gracious teacher has lost his Bible. I have a case, but there's no Bible in it. And I just dropped a whole bunch of cards, and I just dropped more and a pen. So if anybody sees a Bible, that would come in handy. I had it this morning. I opened it up. This is what I do. So when people are confident, thank you, Dave. Dun, 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 dun. Thank you. It's always funny when people hand me things and they're really confident that it's in good hands, and they're like, really proud that they handed me this. And I'm like, thanks. You have no idea how quickly this is going to disappear. But we've been talking about finding hope in a troubled world. And, the sermon today, I'm going to talk about that too, how there's just so much going on right now. And it seems like there's this compound issue where people are getting really discouraged and frustrated and angry and divided on so many different things because of all this anxiety that's being fueled. And so, we're talking about the different stages of grief. We're talking about the need to assess things before we really are able to process trauma. We've been talking about kind of reconstructing things to figure things out so that we don't repeat tragedies over and over. And then we were talking about the different stages of grief and how Jesus became so angry when Lazarus died, to the point where the words that are used in the original language are words of like he's visibly shaken and he's breathing hard and he's angry. And I think that's such a normal response to grief. And that's part of living in sorrow, that we go through these stages of anger and denial and, just trying to process it all. I want to talk about another story today. It's kind of a lengthy text, so I don't have a whole lot on the slides just because it would have been pretty tedious to lay this all out. So I'm going to read some from the Bible, or actually a lot from the Bible, and then we're going to have some up on the slide. But today we're talking about the story of, it's actually several stories together, but the beheading of John the Baptist and how Jesus and his disciples responded to that. Because I think when we read the scriptures, we really don't get the full impact of how this impacted them and how they responded to it. As we talk about living in a troubled world, it's not just about death. Certainly there are all different kinds of trauma. There are all kinds of different issues in life. There's financial trouble, poverty. We just helped a family get fuel oil. They were dangerously low on fuel oil. And this congregation, through the generosity of somebody who gave a gift, we were able to get them oil right before these temperatures plummeted into sub-zero temperatures. And it's those sorts of things that just bring so much anxiety on people and health issues, chronic health issues. I mean, we could go on and on and on and on and on. So it's not just about death, but, the past couple weeks we've been talking about death just because that's such a unique form of trauma. And I'll show you how people responded. So here's Dave's favorite gory slide. But this is John the Baptist's head on a platter. There you see Herodias with the little grin. She's the one who wanted this. So I'm not going to leave this slide up forever because it is a little morbid. But I think that picture really captured kind of the Jekyll and Hyde, she's smirking, she's happy, this brings her joy, she's twisted. John the Baptist was a good man. He was, I don't know, he's the one who paved the way for Jesus. And I know Charles and I have talked a lot about this too. Being a Christian doesn't guarantee your safety. It doesn't guarantee your comfort. It doesn't guarantee your health. It doesn't guarantee that you're not going to be targeted. And John the Baptist is a living, breathing example of that. Not even being John the Baptist could protect him. Look at all the prophets, right? They were not protected because they were godly people. At least not in the sense that we look at protection. So how did they respond? I'm going to back the story up a little bit before we get to verse 21. I'm just going to jump in and read. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others said he's Elijah. And others said he's a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted him put to death. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he, that is King Herod, kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. So I'm going to pause here for a second because I think there are a couple things going on here that are worth noting. One is that John the Baptist spoke the truth no matter who the audience was. John the Baptist didn't do what we often do as Christians, where we try to be, politically correct, or we try not to offend people, or we kind of soften things, or we try to. This happens a lot in Christianity, especially among preachers, where preachers want a message that's really palatable. They want a message that appeals to people, that draws people in, that draws a crowd, that connects with people, that encourages people, that motivates people, that helps people move along and be better Christians, right? You don't hear a lot of preachers, at least anymore. Back in the 60s, you heard a good bit of it. But you don't hear a lot of hellfire and brimstone. You just don't. You have a lot of really watered down messages. Now, that's not to say that doesn't exist, because it certainly does. And there are certain circles where it's just completely overboard. That's all you hear is damnation, and everybody's going to hell, and yelling and screaming and pounding the pulpit. That still goes on. And I think a lot of that is spiritual abuse. I really do. But John the Baptist wasn't an arrogant, angry, hateful, spiteful man. He was respectful. He was bold in what he said. He spoke truth, and yet people liked him. King Herod liked him. And I get the sense in the scripture, in this passage, that Herod almost was like on the fence, and he was like, I want to not like John because I really, the things he says perplexes me, but I can't dislike John the Baptist. The guy's just, I really enjoy him. I like him. So I get the sense that was their relationship, which is really interesting to me. But I think it's so important. We can speak the truth and not back down from the truth and still be likable people. We don't have to get in people's faces, and we don't have to tell people how wrong they are and just berate people. I think that's such a bizarre and spiritually abusive method. So, I just want to say that. John the Baptist, I think, was, he was bold, he was kind, he was likable. And now we pick up in verse 21. Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. And when the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, "Ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you." And he promised her with an oath, "Whatever you ask, I will give you up to half of my kingdom." I don't know what happened in the scene, but this must have been one heck of a dance. I mean, to offer up to half of the kingdom, you don't have to use a whole lot of imagination to picture what was going on here. I imagine it was debauchery on steroids. And I don't remember, Charles, you can help me out here. And forgive me, I didn't take the time. I have a really bad memory, so I didn't take the time to go back and remember. Herodias was also related to Herod. And I don't remember how. So it wasn't just that she was the sister-in-law. She married Philip, Herod's brother, but she was also related to them.
I don't remember.
There was some blood relationship to Herod and his brother Philip, and I can't remember what it was. And I think it was a pretty close relationship, if I remember correctly. But it's been many years, and I didn't brush back up. But I think that was part of the issue that John the Baptist had. It wasn't just that you took your brother Philip's wife; it's that she's also closely related to you. And again, as they say in the South, you don't supposed to do that. So verse 24, she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask for?" "The head of John the Baptist," she answered. At once the girl hurried to the king with the request, "I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her. Can you imagine how embarrassing that would have been with all these noble people there? They all witnessed this request, and can you imagine the king say, "I can't do that for you," after he just promised with an oath that he would give her up to half of the kingdom. Verse 26, this is interesting to me. The king was greatly distressed. But because of his oaths and his dinner guest, he did not want to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing of this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. I think we can't take away how disturbing and dishonorable this death was. This takes persecution to a whole nother level. I don't know about you guys. We don't think about death and the gruesome details of death very often. It's just not pretty. It's not nice to think about. But it's a reality that people face every day. You know, every day I look at the news, which is not the most upbeat, encouraging thing to do. But I like to keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on around the world. And yeah, I read, there was an article the other day that caught my attention, and I don't know if you guys saw this, driver in Las Vegas that went through the intersection 100 miles an hour, killed himself, his passenger, and hit a minivan that was full of these little kids. Killed them all. In all, there were, 9 people who died. They released the 911 call, which I always find interesting on a bunch of different levels. I won't get onto that soapbox. I didn't listen to the 911 call, but I read some of the transcripts, and that was disturbing enough. And somebody on the phone said, cover your eyes, there are kids. Those are babies." People witnessed this trauma. There were eyewitnesses who not only saw the crash happen, they saw the aftermath. I've spoken to police officers, quite a few police officers, who are in deep therapy, trauma therapy, because of accidents, because of witnessing the things that they witnessed, things like this. I think a lot of times we read this and we just kind of gloss over it because we don't think about the gruesomeness of what happened in the scene. And we do that we're guilty of doing that with a lot of scriptures, where we read about it. And I remember hearing one preacher talk about the millstone passage. Jesus talks about it'd be better for these people to have a large millstone tied around their neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea than to cause one of my little ones to stumble. You know what he did? Not only did he not read that passage, he was talking about God's grace and God's mercy. And, Matthew 18 there's all this fluff, all this good stuff towards the end of Matthew 18. People don't like the beginning of Matthew 18. They like all the stuff on mercy. And, Peter says, if somebody sins against me, how many times do I forgive them? People like those passages. Here's how he handled that passage, the millstone passage. He said, there's a section here, a little paragraph that I'm not really comfortable with, and it's some pretty hard things to hear, so we're just going to skip over that, and I'm going to pick up. And then he just started reading, and I'm like, no. See, we don't like to think about the gruesomeness and the ugliness, and so we are so unprepared, even though we know we're all going to die, even though we know that family members are going to die, we know that kids are going to die before their parents, we know that accidents like what happened in Las Vegas are going to happen. We know that, and we don't prepare for that. And I think John's disciples are certainly traumatized by this, but I think that death was so talked about and common in the first century. Like, people didn't hide from it the way that we do, and they don't live in the West like we do, where you jam your feelings down and you're like, it's like the trash can that gets full, and you're like eventually you're pushing it down, and then eventually you're like trying to pile more stuff in it. So then you're like hanging on to the light fixture, and you're like standing on top of the trash trying to smash it down because you just want to get as much trash in there as possible. And we do that with our emotions in the West. We don't deal with stuff head on. We don't grieve. We don't cry. We don't scream. We don't yell. In fact, we tell people, as a Christian, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't shout at God. You shouldn't shake your fist at God. I mean, we tell people that. Be strong for your kids. I tell people the opposite. Like, show your kids your emotions. Show your kids that you cared about their dad who just died. Show your kids that you're angry. Show your kids that your heart's broken. Let them feel that. Model anger at death. Model sorrow at death. So we have this scene going on with John the Baptist. I don't remember it yet, but I don't have more. So I'm gonna read ahead here in the Bible, because I think this is just such a powerful story. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. This is when Jesus had sent them out. So I find this interesting too. Timing-wise, the disciples were not with Jesus when John the Baptist was beheaded. Can you imagine what that did for them? You remember what Jesus told them, his pep talk? You remember his pep talk to his disciples when he sends them out? What did he tell them? I use this a lot when I do seminars on abuse. How did Jesus prepare his disciples when he sends them out in groups of 2? What did he tell them they would face and encounter? Hope, encouragement, kindness. He sends them out. And it's such a short, I think it's like 9 or 12 verses. And I was like, man, Jesus in 9 or 12 verses equipped his disciples better than what 9 years of college and graduate school did for me, because I was never taught that you're going to encounter these kinds of things in the church. Jesus says, be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. You're going to go into these towns and you're going to see persecutions. You're going to face persecutions. You're going to see father rise against father, or father rise against son and kill him. You're going to see son rise against father and kill him. You're going to experience floggings, beatings, and he goes on. He gives them this big laundry list of things. And then he uses this little interesting phrase, in their synagogues. Like, he's not talking about facing gangs out there, you know. He's not talking about going into rough neighborhoods and parts of the city that you're not supposed to be in. And he's talking about in the synagogues, these things are going to happen. You're going to come in to righteous people's territory, and they are going to be vile. They're going to beat you. They're going to slander you. They're going to kill each other. You're going to witness these. This is not hypothetical. Jesus says you will experience these things. And then he sends them out. And as they're experiencing these things, what news do they hear while they're out there? John the Baptist not only was killed, he was beheaded, his head on a platter and brought to the king. Well, why is that important about who killed John the Baptist? Yeah. By a very powerful person who has jurisdiction, just happens to have jurisdiction over Jesus himself and his disciples. I mean, he's the one who did this. So we're going to go on. The apostles returned to Jesus, told him all that they had done and taught, and he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. I love Mark's retelling of this story because Mark is the only one who records this little bit of information. They had no leisure even to eat. The crowds were so great. They're in the middle of grieving the loss of John the Baptist. They're trying to figure out, okay, what's our mission? How does this all tie in? Like this, there's all this bombardment of bad news. And what's Jesus tell them? Hold your heads up, hold your chins up, strap on a smile. Let's work for the Lord. Right? Does he tell them that? No, he says, let's get away. You guys need to rest. It's kind of an interesting subject too. I know a lot of ministers who have burned out, are burned out. I mean fried, like cooked. And they're like, I just wish that I would get a sabbatical. I wish my leaders would understand the importance of a sabbatical. And a sabbatical is typically, they range anywhere from like 6 weeks to 3 months. And virtually no ministers get sabbaticals. And this is not like me gerrymandering people to get a sabbatical. I'm just saying in the church where people are really stretched thin, where they experience these major peaks and major valleys constantly. And Nisi, I use this as an example because I remember the day that Lloyd died really clearly, because I was on my way to do a wedding for Allison when I got the call from Tex that Lloyd was, within minutes or hours of dying. And I just remember feeling this emotional pull where I'm like, I'm literally on my way to officiate the happiest day of this couple's life. And then there's this other reality that you're sitting with your husband as he's dying, and it's this major tug and pull constantly.
People have this perception of the job of a preacher. Where is your, ye a little faith? Or where is your faith? And things that are thrown out to them. But the truth of the matter is, you're human.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, and an entitlement to sabbatical, to call on help of church leaders, to rely on members of your congregation to help you out.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is, as we're talking about finding hope in the middle of a troubled world, I think that what would be so much more helpful for anybody in not just ministry, but in the church, in life, in the world, What would be more beneficial than a little, 3-week or 3-month, 6-week or 3-month period of time would be giving people the ability when tragedy strikes to take a week off or take whatever time they need in that moment to process this all. I think that would be really helpful. And it's exactly what Jesus is doing here. I keep losing my place here. Okay, so verse 32, and they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. So they listened to Jesus. Jesus says, you guys need to get away. You need to rest. Go to this deserted place, find rest. Verse 33, now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. And I didn't put up a map, but the Sea of Galilee is 11 miles north to south and 6 miles east to west. They're on the west side, and they're going by boat to the east side. Boat is not the fastest form of transportation. When you're rowing 6 miles, not exactly the fastest. The people are running up along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and they outran the disciples. And so the disciples, thinking that they're going to this private, desolate place to get rest, in the wake of John the Baptist's beheading, in the wake of going into these towns and experiencing all these horrific things, they think they're getting rest, but instead, this is what happens. And this sets the stage for the feeding of the 5,000. They ran ahead on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. Verse 34, when he went on shore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're physically exhausted, if you're emotionally exhausted, if you're spiritually exhausted, does anybody like me and you get really agitated when you're tired, you're sleep deprived, and like every noise, like noises that don't normally bother you, they're like skull piercing. And you're like, all right, I know I'm getting irritated right now. I'm going to bite my tongue. And then like blood starts coming out and you look like a vampire because you're like biting your tongue so hard. And you're like, it's not fair to lash out on my kids because they're just being kids. But it's really annoying, Like we get agitated, and I think that's just part of being human. We get really irritable when we're tired. These guys have probably been days without sleep. They've probably been days without food. They just got the news that John the Baptist died, was beheaded. They're trying to get away from people. And not only did they not get away from people, how many people are here? Thousands and thousands of people. You want to talk about a kick to the gut? And Jesus looks at them, by the way, in his exhaustion, and he has compassion on them. Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He begins to teach them, and then when it grew late, his disciples came and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. In other words, can we please find some place to sleep? I just want to, I remember driving truck, and this isn't anywhere close to what these guys felt. I remember days where I just wanted to collapse. I was like, I have reached my absolute limit. I've reached my limit with people. I've reached my limit with CB chatter and all that noise and cussing, and I've reached my limit with a lack of sleep. I've reached my limit with counting dotted lines down the highway. I've reached my limit with being responsible. I've reached my limit with, fighting with DOT cops. I've reached my limit with life. I am ready to collapse. And I remember one day, I pulled into a rest area. I was like, I cannot pedal this truck one more foot. And I pulled into a rest stop, and I had just fallen asleep, and I feel the truck shaking. And I was like, it's like in my sleep. I'm like, is this really happening? And then boom, 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 boom. This guy knocks on the door. And I'm going to tell on myself here because it wasn't the prettiest. I did not have compassion like Jesus. And this guy says, roll your window down. He's in plain clothes. Roll your window down. I said, for what? He said, well, I'm an off-duty DOT officer, and I need to see your logbook. And I could tell the guy's lying through his teeth. And I said, well, show me your badge. Show me that you're a DOT officer. He's like, well, I don't have to show you. And he's like, put your window down or I'm going to tear your window. Like, I'm going to break it. And I said, no. I said, not until I see a badge and you show me that you're an officer. I said, I'm trying to sleep and you're waking me up. And he just kept on. So I literally put my truck in reverse. It was running. I put my truck in reverse and I said, you have about 3 seconds to get out of here. I said, your car's going to be flattened. And he ran back and got in his car and took off. And, it's like you get so agitated and irritated. And these guys, it's got to be magnified 1,000-fold because they were just so riddled with grief and sorrow and frustration. And there's a sea of people. And Jesus has compassion. And now they're saying, this is a desolate place. The hour's now late. In other words, it's time. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. Can you imagine? I'm pretty sure they loved and feared and respected Jesus, but in this moment, I'm not so sure that they were batting their eyes at Jesus. It's almost like a smart aleck response. You give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And I think this is anger coming out. I think they're frustrated. They're being sarcastic. And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. And so they sat down in groups by hundreds and fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. And the story doesn't stop here. We're not going to have time to read the next part. But maybe we'll pick up next week because I would really want to unpack this. The next scene is the walking on water. Immediately, listen to this verse. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida, where they had just been. These guys are days without sleep. John the Baptist dead. Thousands of people lined up. Dave and I last night were at a wedding reception. There were 2 ladies who handed out food to about 100 people. Somehow Dave, I don't know what voodoo he worked, but he got his food before everybody. He's the last one to show up. And the waitress she was laughing. She's like, yep. She's like, I don't know who you know, but she's like, here's your food. But it took forever. It took over an hour for 2 people to feed about 80, 90 people. Can you imagine how long it took 12 people to feed thousands? I mean, this scene, by the time they're in the middle of the water and the storm hits them and they're rowing and they're exhausted, it's like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Which means they didn't set out until probably well after midnight. I can't imagine. And the whole point of today is just to talk about finding that balance. There's this need to have compassion on people, and I think Jesus demonstrated that. And I think the way that Mark puts these stories together is really highlighting the compassion of Jesus. He's not minimizing the sorrow whatsoever. He's not minimizing the weight of what they felt, the exhaustion, the irritation, the short tempers, the kind of snapping back at Jesus. Mark's not minimizing any of that. And how many of us lose patience for people constantly who their life isn't just a series of a few days strung out where they're lack of sleep and, high stress. There are people who are chronically in these kinds of scenarios. I know people who experience death after death after death, days in a row within their family. And they're exhausted. They're irritable. They're broken down, worn down, drained, emotionally tired, sorrowful. Sorrow upon sorrow upon sorrow. And I wonder what happens internally to them when they hear people say things like, well, what got into you? What's your problem? I think we're all guilty of this at different times, but we kind of assume that if our life is kind of humming along, everybody else's is too. And we see people at their worst, and people snap. Do you ever have somebody snap at you? You say hi, and somebody's just like, they're like, they mumble something under their breath, and you're like, like we take it so personally. We're like, well, I'll never talk to you again. Well, fine, And we kind of puff up, we flare up at them. Maybe there's something going on inside of their life. Maybe there's a lot of things going on inside of their life. And I like this story because it shows that Jesus in all of this, it's almost like, I really struggle with these stories, I really do. Because part of me wants to say, Jesus is compassionate to all these people who ran to the other side, and he uses his tired disciples. He didn't get people in the crowd who were rested up. He used his exhausted disciples to be the ones to hand out the food. And then they're like, man, it's late, it's the hour's now. And he says, I'm commanding you, I'm making you get in that boat and go across the lake. I'll meet you over there. He doesn't even go with them. I'm like, what a slap in, part of me is like, what a slap in the face to them. And then this big storm, can you imagine when that storm hit? They're rowing across the lake, they're so exhausted. And I don't know about you, but your muscles just start to break down when you're that tired. I'm trying to row. Every row is just misery. You're like, we just want to get there. And then the wind comes. And the lightning. And the waves. And I think in my mind, I'd be like, are you blanking kidding me right now? After everything that we've experienced, you're sitting on the comfort of the shore while we're in the middle of this lake, risking our lives. And this was a big storm. And I picture them just cursing at Jesus under their breath. And then Jesus comes, and of course he calms the storm. We'll unpack that next week, but there's so much going on in this story, and I mean, this is all part of processing. And it shows life doesn't always work the way that we think it's going to work. And so how do we handle that? How are the disciples still hopeful through all of this? We're going to take a hard break there. I am really up against the clock. We'll see you all in about 15 minutes, and then next week we're going to come back to this. Thank you all.